Great. So thank you for being here. My name is Stephen Rubenstein. I'm the rabbi of Congregation Beth Ahm. I don't really start all of my classes by introducing myself that way, because usually I'm speaking mostly to people from the congregation. And of course, we do have, many of you, as you know, are from Beth Ahm, but we do have people who I don't know, and which is great. I'm really, really glad that you heard about this class and that you joined us. So I am doing a series this year called The Basics, Foundations of Judaism. And there are 4 sessions over the course of the year. They're spread out several months apart. And this is the first one. It's on the Jewish holidays. And my aim is, in some way, though I'm going to modify this repeatedly over the night, but the aim is to cover, discuss, introduce, however you want to say it, all of the holidays of the Jewish calendar. Now, that is a challenging thing to do because there's so much to say. You could give a full course on each one of the holidays and more. Books and books and books have been written about the Jewish holidays from all sorts of different perspectives. But I think that there is something, whether for people who learned all the holidays at some point in the past and need a refresher, or whether you never learned the Jewish holidays, there is something to spending a concentrated amount of time to learn the whole cycle and then go back and learn each piece, one piece after another. But today we're going to try and cover everything, at least from a couple of different perspectives. I would love for you to go away from this session knowing the main ideas of a bunch of the holidays, and especially of the major groups of holidays. And we're going to do that by looking at the holidays in groups. You're going to keep seeing the same list. It's going to be color-coded most times so that you get a sense of what these holidays are as a group and what these holidays are as a group. And I hope that just by making some distinctions, you're going to get an understanding of the different types of holidays and what the holiday calendar really is all about. One way we're going to look at the holidays is through a bifocal, let's say. One lens is going to talk about the national ideas in the Jewish holidays. A good example of that would be Passover, which in some ways is the holiday which celebrates the birth of the Jewish people. That's on the one hand, a national holiday, as opposed to, let's say, Yom Kippur, which of course is celebrated by the nation, the Jewish nation, but its themes are much more focused on the individual as opposed to nationhood. And we'll talk about that as we go. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg is a really important modern Orthodox thinker who wrote a really great book about the Jewish holidays. And he argues that if there's one theme that unites all of the Jewish holidays, it's actually the idea of redemption. And he sees Passover as the holiday that imprints itself on all of the other holidays. That's another lens we may want to look at. To what extent does redemption, is redemption a thread that weaves its way through the entire Jewish holiday cycle? I think we might make an argument that it won't fit for each holiday, but for many of them, that might be, again, another lens to look at the holidays through. I just got an email a couple of weeks ago, I think it was actually just last week, from someone who asked me, how come we celebrate so many sad things? It was right around Tisha B'Av, which we're going to talk about a little later on. Tisha B'Av is a remembrance of the destruction of the first temple and second temples that stood in Jerusalem. But he said not just that, he was just thinking about it around that most sad day, perhaps the saddest day of the Jewish year. But he said, even Passover, which I keep coming back to, Passover, we were enslaved. Why would that be a day to celebrate? So, I wrote down on my little notes here about the oys and the joys of the Jewish holidays. The oys and the joys, right? Sometimes we think about the idea that sort of silly saying, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat, right? That's the sort of silly way of understanding the Jewish holidays. But I do think that I would love for you to walk away with a deeper sense of the holidays such that you don't end up feeling that it's really just a bunch of remembrances of sad events. Certainly Passover is not really about that. Even, holidays that have a story of war in them. For example, Hanukkah, which is really about a battle, a war against the Syrian Greeks. There's a very good reason why we think of Hanukkah as a very joyous holiday and not one that dwells on the negative. I think we'll come around to that as well. Something which I wanted to say near the outset as well, which I just seemed important to say, and I feel like in talking about the theological ideas, I might forget to say something really important, like, especially for those who really don't know the Jewish holidays at all. Jewish holidays are very much about family. So much of the way we think about Jewish tradition, so much of it happens in the synagogue. It's about ideas, it's about texts, it's about rituals, and that's true. But of course, for those who have lived the Jewish holidays, we know that so much of our memories of Jewish holidays surround family at the table, at the menorah, in the sukkah, perhaps, right? So family celebration, I hope we'll come back to this as well as we get ready. I'm almost about to be at the end of my long list of introductory comments. Soon we're going to have a little graphic on the screen. Yes, this is, there's a lot of introductory stuff. Okay, here's another thing. Not only is it about family, but the holidays, and so many of the holidays are wrapped up in not only the people remembering to celebrate themselves, but to include those who are having a challenging time celebrating, the poor in the community. So this might be something that even people who celebrate Passover may not know, that in advance of Passover, we are encouraged to give ma'ot chitim, money for wheat, so that even the poorest among us can have matzah at their table. Maimonides, one of the greatest rabbis of the Middle Ages, says, if you're having a celebration on one of the holidays and you don't have the poor, the orphan, or the widow at your table, it's a celebration of your stomach, not a celebration of the holiday. He doesn't mean that in a good way, by the way. For all of us who, I know we care about what's on the menu, but Maimonides reminds us that it can't only be about us and satisfying us. And this theme goes through Purim, it goes through Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, it goes through Sukkot, it goes through all of the holidays as well. A couple of words about the Jewish calendar, for those who may not know. The Jewish calendar is a mixed calendar of lunar and solar. Primarily, it's a lunar calendar. It's 12 months. But each lunar month has 29 and a half days, okay, which practically speaking means that Jewish months have 29 days, 30 days, right? It varies, but it's a half day in there and it gets a little bit tricky. Now, in the Julian calendar, right, the calendar that we use in the United States, we have a leap year every once in a while, and we add a day to even things up. In the Jewish calendar, we add a whole extra month. In fact, starting this Rosh Hashanah is going to be a leap year. We're going to have 2 months of Adar next spring, basically, because even though we have this lunar calendar and so much goes by the moon, we are also tied to agricultural seasons. And in particular, we need 3 holidays to be at the right season: Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And even more primarily, Passover itself needs to be in the spring. So we can't keep losing a little bit of time. We sort of lose time, and then we push everything forward so that Passover ends up in the spring, because one of the themes of Passover is related to that very season, to the agricultural season, having to do with planting, right? Planting and harvesting at particular times, all linked to the land of Israel, which is another theme of many of the holidays, our connection to the land of Israel. Even though Jews have been living outside of the land of Israel for thousands of years, in addition to in the land of Israel, we are linked through our holidays to the land of Israel. Okay, finally, the one holiday I'm not really going to talk much about, and some people say it's not really a holiday, it's kind of nonsense argument back and forth, but a critical day, whether you call it a holiday or not, perhaps the most critical day of the year, happens every 7 days in the Jewish calendar, and that's Shabbat. The Sabbath, Shabbat, happens every 7 days, linked to the idea that God is the creator of the world, and God rests. After 6 days of work, God rests on the seventh day, and so should we. Work and rest. And that idea of a 7-day cycle is not only built into our weekly schedule, and therefore monthly and yearly schedule, but into the holidays themselves. Passover, though celebrated outside the land of Israel for 8 days traditionally, and Sukkot, also for 8 days, they are, according to the Torah, 7-day festivals. Okay, so those are all my introductions. Wow, I did those so fast. I'm sure you got all the details. All right, I'm going to pause for 3 minutes, if it takes that long, for any questions you have so far. I will reserve the right to delay answering them as we go. But if anyone has any questions about all of that introductory material, I don't blame you. Okay, great. Okay, here we go. I mentioned Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. His English name is Irving. This is the same one. He wrote this book, The Jewish Way. The holy days are the unbroken master code of Judaism. Decipher them and you will discover the inner sanctum of this religion. Grasp them and you hold the heart of the faith in your hand. The holy days are the quintessential Jewish religious expression because the main teachings of Judaism are incorporated in their messages. Recurrent experience of these days has sustained the Jews on their long march through history. By interpreting and reinterpreting the holidays and by applying their lessons to daily life, the Jewish people have been continuously guided along the Jewish way. He liked that sentence at the end so much that he named his book after it. See that? The Jewish Way. So the holidays become not just stopping points around the year, but containers for the essential ideas, which not only inform those holidays, but by celebrating the holidays, they inform all of Jewish life that happens outside of those holidays. I'm going to give you just one example of that, where we haven't come to the specific holidays yet, but I know many of you know Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the New Year and the Day of Atonement. And the key idea of that whole season, one might argue, I think pretty legitimately, is Chuva, repentance. And from time to time over the course of the year, I will remind people that Chuva is not just for that time of year. Chuva is something which is embedded in the Amidah, our central prayer, 3 times a day. And it is part and parcel of what living a meaningful life is, a meaningful Jewish life, and I'd say beyond that, not just Jews, the idea of tshuva, repentance and restoration and turning from one thing to the next. It is not only for those 10 days in September this year, right? It is meant to be for the whole year. So just as Yitz Greenberg says, right, it is a container for this idea that really gets infused throughout the year. And we could talk about Shavuot that way, or Simchat Torah, or Tu Bishvat, or whatever, and we will a little bit. Okay. Okay. Might be a little hard to see at the size I need to make it, but I hope it's going to work out a little bit. Okay. So we have here sort of a calendar, seasonal right in the middle. fall, winter. I'm starting with fall because that's where the new year starts. Fall, winter, spring, and summer. You see at the top of the page, Rosh Hashanah, and you see how the holidays are grouped together. I think for those who celebrate the holidays, we have this innate sense of like, oh yeah, there's like the fall holidays and there's the spring holidays. They don't all fit together. We're going to talk about how they are sort of somewhat different one from the other as well, but clearly there is a flow, actually, that someone might argue that goes, and this chart sort of argues, it goes from Tisha B'Av into Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Simchat Torah. There are 7 weeks. Remember, there's that number 7 again. It goes from Tisha B'Av and leads us into the new year, to the Day of Atonement, and into Sukkot and Simchat Torah. And then there's like we're done for a little bit until you get to Hanukkah. But especially once you get to Purim over here, we have another trend. Purim into Passover, and we're going to Passover into Shavuot. We'll see how these two holidays fit in. Whoops. Israel Independence Day and Holocaust Remembrance Day do or don't fit into that. But you do have a flow from Purim to Passover to Shavuot, and the weekly Torah reading and Haftarot help us connect those holidays, prepare us for those holidays, so they don't just sort of spring up on us. Like someone who is really connected with the holiday cycle doesn't wake up and say, oh my God, tonight's the first Seder, I didn't even know. The calendar itself allows us to prepare ourselves spiritually, and maybe especially for Passover, physically, to prepare our homes for the holiday, because there's a lot of preparation involved. Okay. By the way, if you look at a holiday like Hanukkah, it really does seem like it's sort of hanging out by itself. You see, there's no curve uniting it with what comes before or after it. And that says something about the holiday, perhaps, about its history and its connection to other holidays. So now I want to bring you to a series of charts. Again, these are my little color-coded. They're not fancy at all. They're just lists, really. But I want to show you the holidays from a couple of different perspectives. Here's a list of the holidays. We just saw them on the chart, but here's a list of the holidays. Okay. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, Simchat Torah. Those are the fall holidays. Again, I don't know everyone who's out there, so I'm going to very quickly give you these names in English, more or less, right? Rosh Hashanah is the new year, and Yom Kippur is the Day of Atonement. Sukkot is the festival of booths, because we erect these outdoor booths in which we either live in or at the very least eat our meals in. Shmini Atzeret is an individual one-day holiday which comes after Sukkot. And Simchat Torah is a celebration of, it's the rejoicing with the Torah, where we finish reading the yearly cycle of the Torah reading and start again. Hanukkah, which is often called the Festival of Lights. Tu Bishvat, which some of you may not be familiar with. Tu Bishvat is the 15th of Shvat, the month of Shvat. We're going to talk about that a little later on, but it is it's often called the birthday of trees, and it's very focused on the land of Israel and trees, right? and environmental concerns. Purim is a one-day festival that is focused on the book of Esther, which you find in the latter part of the Bible. Passover, the Feast of Redemption or Freedom. Yom HaShoah is the day of Holocaust Remembrance Day. Yom HaZikaron is Israel's Memorial Day for soldiers and those killed in terror attacks. Yom HaAtzmaut is Israel's Independence Day. Shavuot is the Feast of Weeks. It comes 7 weeks after Passover, Pesach. And Tisha B'Av is the 9th of the month of Av. We just had that a couple of weeks ago. And as I mentioned that earlier, it is the day on which we remember that not only the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem and the second temple in Jerusalem, but other tragic events that are all sort of grouped together on that day. That is definitely one of the oys. Okay. So I give this all to you in black and white, literally, so that you can now see that actually there are distinctions to be made amongst these holidays, which are meaningful in terms of practice and in terms of the framework we might understand them. So, where do our holidays come from? Well, some of them come directly from the Torah. And just as a quick little reminder, the Tanakh is the Jewish Bible. Okay? The Tanakh is an acronym for three parts of the Bible: Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, writings. Okay? So even though all three of these sections are the Bible, the Torah is the first one, and it is the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. For those who know this and think don't need to tell you that, believe me when I tell you that there are people who find that new information. And so that's why I wanted to make sure everyone knew that. Holidays from the Torah, here they are. Look at all the ones that are in red and all the ones that are not. What's the difference? Well, on the one hand, holidays from the Torah are practiced, are observed in quite similar ways and very much connected to the way we celebrate and observe Shabbat. For those of you who have a sense of Shabbat observance, you know that there are things we do: candle lighting, Kiddush, Motzi, synagogue, all of that, right? And then there are things that we refrain from doing in order to create a space for Shabbat. We don't work. We don't, traditionally, we don't engage in commerce. We don't buy and sell things. Well, those are the things that we also don't do on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the festival days of Sukkot. There's also these intermediate days: Shmini Atzeret, Pesach, and Shavuot. These days are hard stops in our daily life. We prepare for them. We have festive meals. We refrain from going to work. No festive meal on Yom Kippur, by the way, because that's a fast day, right? But that is one of the things that we're doing on these holidays. We are stopping our work and celebrating these holidays. You also could argue that these festivals are all connected, right, of course, to the most ancient strand of Jewish practice, right, the Torah itself, whereas the ones that come after have to be attached to something later, historical or otherwise. Even you'll see in a bit, we're going to have another level and another level till we get to the 20th century. Okay. Let's talk about these holidays in a little bit more detail before we move on, though. I'm going to pause for comment before I do that, though. Comments or questions? Thanks, Marianne. We say that Shabbat is 25 hours because it starts a little bit before sundown, but it doesn't end until complete dark. So that's 25 hours. It's not sundown to sundown, which would be about 24 hours. It's extended a little bit. You got it. Okay, let me go back to my chart and let's talk about these holidays. Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of the year. I'm going to do these kind of quickly, and then we'll take questions. Again, we have sort of a mixed group. It's a little hard to know how much everyone knows, so I came prepared to give a little brief synopsis of each one. Rosh Hashanah, the new year. We also are beginning the 10 days of repentance, which lasts from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur. We celebrate Rosh Hashanah with the sweetness of apples and honey with the sound of the shofar, which is supposed to both remind God that we are the children of Abraham, who brought his son Isaac up to Mount Moriah when he was commanded to sacrifice him. And God, of course, told Abraham not to do that at the last minute. Instead, Abraham sacrificed a ram. And so we blow the horn, either of a ram or of another animal, to remind God. But also the ram's horn, the shofar, is supposed to call us to examine who we are and do, as I said earlier, do Chuva, that key word of the season, to do atone and ask for forgiveness of people we know and also of God. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, is seen as the day on which we begin to be judged on Rosh Hashanah, and we are finally judged on Yom Kippur. It is one of only 2 full day fasts. It starts Erev, the night before Yom Kippur, and it lasts until dark. No eating, no drinking. We perform atonement, and as I'm on a little bit of I've got a mission to remind people that Yom Kippur is not supposed to be a sad holiday. It is meant to be a serious holiday, of course, but it is meant to be a holiday which ultimately is optimistic. The idea that we can be transformed, that we can stand before someone and ask for forgiveness and be granted forgiveness, that we can offer forgiveness, that God will offer us forgiveness, and we end the day with a sense of being purified. That possibility is not only for that moment, but as I say, for the entire year. The idea that we can change is at root an optimistic idea about what our lives are really about. Just 5 days after Yom Kippur, we have Sukkot. We build in those days between Yom Kippur and Sukkot a sukkah and an outdoor booth with a roof that can be seen through so that we can see the stars. It is a temporary dwelling, not meant to be permanent, to both remind us of the fact that God cared for the Jewish people while we were in the wilderness after we left Egypt on our way to the land of Israel, and also as a reminder of the fragility of life. A really strong wind is supposed to be able to blow over a sukkah. You don't want it to be so permanent that you misunderstand the meaning that all of life and all of physicality is permanent. In fact, quite the opposite. What is around us, the physicality of the world, our own life, it's very heavy here, our own life is impermanent, okay? Shmini, there's more to say about that, but we're going to leave it there. Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day, even though it's an independent holiday, Sukkot actually has a very important universal theme, which is that the whole world is judged for rain at that time. And in the temple, we brought sacrifices, not just for the Jewish people, but for all of the peoples of the world. And so there are 70 bulls that are brought to the temple, were brought to the temple. One for each nation. There's this idea in Jewish tradition that there are 70 nations. On Shmini Atzeret, only 1 bull is brought, and that's for the Jewish people. And the underlying image of Shmini Atzeret that I really appreciate is that, God has sent us back home after Sukkot, and it's time to go back. I'll explain the coming and going back in a moment, but it's like when your child is home after being away for a long time. They come home and it's time for them to go, and you say, don't go yet, stay 1 more day. And God keeps us close for 1 more day before sending us back to our homes, not the impermanence of the sukkah, but our permanent homes. And then we come to Pesach, which I've talked about quite a bit already. Matzah, wine, redemption from slavery. Yitz Greenberg, who I keep mentioning, Yitz Greenberg makes quite a big deal about the idea that Pesach is not only a blueprint, let me say it differently, it is not only the story of the redemption of the Jewish people at some time in the past, but a blueprint for redemption for the entire world today and in the future. It is not meant to be only our story, but a universal story. Shavuot is a celebration of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, and the role of Torah in our lives. We celebrate Shavuot in a variety of ways. One of them is that we stay up all night for a Tikkun Leil Shavuot. We prepare ourselves to receive the Torah in the morning by staying up all night already learning Torah. Since I've been looking at my chart, I'm now looking back at you. I'm going to go to our next color-coded chart after I see if anyone has any questions. Okay. So, holidays from the Torah. So a subset of this is the Shalosh Regalim, pilgrimage festivals. They're called pilgrimage festivals because the Jewish people were supposed to make a pilgrimage to the temple up to Jerusalem, where the temple stood, on these festivals. Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret, Pesach and Shavuot. I put Simchat Torah there because it is connected in our celebration to Shmini Atzeret. But as you're going to see in the next slide, Simchat Torah is actually a later holiday. The Torah doesn't actually talk about Simchat Torah. It comes quite a bit later on as a festival, long after the Bible is closed, even after the Mishnah and the Talmud. It's really into the early Gaonic period, for those who know that, but into the maybe 7th, 8th century. So it's quite late as a festival. So these festivals, we come up to make our offerings at the temple. What does that mean for us today? Well, there is no temple, of course, but perhaps in terms of celebrating the holidays, the key part is to connect these festivals with Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, right, which are all Torah holidays. And if you look here, I'd make the Yamim Noraim, the days of awe. You could make an argument that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are really just the days of awe. In many ways, that is the way they're often defined. But as I wrote there as a subtitle there, fall holidays. When people talk about the fall holidays, it really goes from the first of Tishrei, the new year, that is Rosh Hashanah, through Simchat Torah. It's about a three-week period where all of these holidays are celebrated. Okay. Okay. Remember, I showed you the 3 different parts of the Bible: Torah, prophets, and writings. Here, you have some holidays that are mentioned in other parts of the Bible, not the Torah, as well as into the Second Temple period of Jewish history, as well as even a little bit beyond that. So Hanukkah, which some people celebrate as sort of the holiday of the year, though it's not traditionally the most critical holiday. It's not from the Torah. And you could make an argument that, I'm going to take this off the screen for a second and just share my idea of major and minor holidays. And I think it's something that I used to talk about. The major holidays, or in particular, we talk about minor holidays. Purim as a minor holiday, Hanukkah as a minor holiday. And in certain ways they are, right? We don't create a whole structure around them like we do for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot and Pesach. People can work on Purim and on Hanukkah. We don't completely reserve the time, but these are ancient holidays. They may be post-Torah, but they're ancient holidays, and they have been sustaining to the Jewish people. And the ideas in them are critical ideas spiritually and for the Jewish nation in a variety of ways. We will talk about that in just a moment. So let's say a word about Hanukkah. Maybe we don't need to, but Hanukkah is the festival of lights. It's a celebration of the winning of the war between the Maccabees, the Judeans, those who lived in the land of Israel, against the Syrian Greeks. That's the way it's traditionally understood. There is a very strong element of Hanukkah, the Hanukkah story, which is a little bit about civil war among Jews, differences in understanding about what it means to incorporate Hellenism, that is to say Greek culture, into Jewish life, and how much to reject that in favor of preserving, let's say, the Jewish spirit within that Jewish communal life. This would take a long time to sort of completely unpack, but it is a complicated story. When does this happen? 2nd century BCE. Okay, this is the story of the Maccabees, Judah Maccabee, his father Matityahu, who will insist that the laws that are preventing the Jews from celebrating Jewish life, celebrating Shabbat, the study of Torah, the refraining from giving their sons a bris, right, ritual circumcision. They fight against this until they succeed. And as the story goes, though it's a later part of the story in Jewish tradition, they came to purify the temple and found that there was only one small jar of oil that was appropriate for putting in the menorah. The menorah, by the way, is 7 branches, right? There was only one jar of oil. It should have only lasted 1 day, but it lasted famously for 8 days. And it is the 8 days that actually get celebrated by the way we celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days each year. Purim, by the way, is found within the Bible itself. The book of Esther is read at Purim because that is the origin of the Purim holiday. Purim is I was talking with someone about this the other day. Purim is a holiday which is, it is such a scary story that we need to do something to forget how scary it is. What's so scary? The evil Haman is ready to destroy the Jewish people. He is the one with the power. Achashverosh, the king of Persia, in which this Jewish community is living, that the story of the book of Esther is teaching about. King Achashverosh is a bit of a fool, and his foolishness allows evil to happen. And Haman has decided to destroy the Jewish people. And it's only by luck, by lots, actually. Purim are lots, the drawing of lots. It all depends seemingly on luck. God is not even mentioned in the book of Esther. And why? And it's so scary. What do? We celebrate by getting drunk. We celebrate by hiding ourselves behind masks because it seems that that's the only way to be when you're living outside of the land of Israel in a place like Persia, right? To call yourself Esther, even though your real name is Hadassah, right? It's a very serious topic that is transformed into a great celebration on Purim, where there is drinking, there's a lot of noise making, right? You have the grogger, there's gifts given both to friends through mishloach manot, little baskets of food. And remember that theme I talked about earlier, you don't want to have a celebration of the belly, of the stomach. You want to make sure to remember everyone in the community. And so we also have not just mishloach manot, but matanot la'evyonim, gifts to the poor, right, on that day, so that they can celebrate through a Purim Seudah, this festive meal on Purim. Okay, so those are, sorry, let me get back to my little chart. Purim and Hanukkah. And now we want to talk about Tu Bishvat. You know, Tu Bishvat is post-Torah as well, the 15th of the month of Shvat. It's mentioned in the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah is the first real completed work of the rabbinic period, completed around the year 200, a little bit after 200 CE. So Tu B'Shvat is not talked about in the Bible. You'll see Tu B'Shvat highlighted a bit later on as well, because Tu B'Shvat has this very interesting layering. At its earliest level, Tu B'Shvat is a celebration of trees and a reminder of tithing, which produce, at what point you could bring fruits from certain trees to the temple. You had to wait a certain number of years, especially for fruit trees. You didn't pick them and eat them until you first brought offerings. You could only do that after several years, right? So that's the earliest level. In the Middle Ages, Tu B'Shvat becomes a holiday which is infused with Jewish mysticism, the idea of what is at the heart of something and what is the shell. The Tu B'Shvat Seder comes to be, where we talk about seasons. We have 4 cups of wine parallel to Passover, except this wine is different colors. You have a white cup of wine or grape juice to symbolize winter. You have a red to symbolize summer, and you have mixtures for spring and for fall. You eat different fruits from the land of Israel, and also fruits that are completely edible, fruits that are edible only after you take the outside layer off, like an orange, and somewhere you have the pit in the middle, so you can eat the outside but not the inside. And there's mystical meanings behind each one of these different types of fruits. That happens later on. And the final level, at least the one that we're at right now, is also focused on environmental issues. You know, we live in a world where there's enormous attention being brought to environmental issues, and Tu B'Shvat has become a way for many Jewish communities to talk about and to focus on Jewish ideas of sustainability. And finally, in terms of post-Torah but ancient holidays, Tisha B'Av, and I mentioned this earlier, this remembrance of these sad occurrences. In the Mishnah, which I mentioned a little while ago, actually tells us that some of the events that we are remembering actually go all the way back to the Torah. So Tisha B'Av as a holiday isn't mentioned in the Torah, but the rabbis retroject some of the tragic events back into the time of Torah. All right, I'm looking at you again, even though so many of you are covered up. Any questions right now? Okay. Really? I'm a little surprised, I have to say. Is it overwhelming? I'm taking a deep breath. I'm waiting. I'm not going back to my chart yet. Are you doing all right out there? Tracy, you're okay? I can see you shaking your head. Okay. Okay. I'm going to keep going. Oh, Norman, you want to say something?
Did Moses smash the original tablets on Tisha B'Av?
Yes, I believe that is on Tisha B'Av. And then he comes back down with the second set on Yom Kippur.
I know the Jews were expelled from England on Tisha B'Av.
And the other, I don't think I realized that, but the one that's more often talked about is the expulsion from Spain, because it was such a big expulsion in 1492.
The Jews, England was 1280, I think.
Yeah, there weren't so many Jews though. Right. Okay. All right, I'm going back to my chart to the next level. So we had Torah. We had the Shalosh Regalim, these pilgrimage festivals. Fall holidays. Someone's talking, maybe you can mute yourself. Okay. And post-Torah but ancient holidays. And now you have modern holidays. Okay. So I mentioned Tu Bishvat, right, a moment ago. Now I put it in green, right, because that's the one that's about trees, it's about mysticism, it's also about environmental issues. And so I put it in the modern list as well, because I just wanted to highlight that idea that it's an opportunity to focus on sustainability and modern environmental issues. You know, nowadays, there are people who refer to these holidays over here, there it is, as the modern days of awe, or modern high holidays. Okay, Yom HaShoah it's actually Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, right? Holocaust Remembrance Day, and also Day for remembering heroes, right? So Yom HaShoah was set by the Knesset as a day of remembrance, and the Knesset, the Parliament of Israel, and it was set in coordination with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Okay, you know, the idea that the Shoah is a formative, tragic but formative experience in Jewish history is solidified by having a particular day on which we remember. And you know, practices vary about Yom HaShoah in our congregation and with other congregations in our area. For several years now, we've been reading Megillat HaShoah, a special Megillah or scroll that was written to commemorate the Holocaust. One of my teachers, Rabbi David Golinkin, a couple of decades ago, actually wrote a paper suggesting that we should make Yom HaShoah into a fast day, right? Like Tisha B'Av, where we remember those other tragedies, we should make Yom HaShoah into a fast day. For a little bit of time, I actually followed his lead, but for something like this to take hold, it really needs to be a communal endeavor, and it seems not to have taken hold just yet. For the record, there are, throughout Jewish history, days, in particular cities or regions, that were declared as like special days of remembrance. Most of those have been lost with the destruction of those communities in Europe, and because of the Shoah. And in some ways, in place of it is this one day which the entire Jewish world commemorates the Shoah on, which is Yom HaShoah. In Israel, pretty famously also, there is a stoppage of, well, the community is really transformed, the country is transformed. What's on TV and what's on the radio changes, the music changes, and there is a siren that goes off on Yom HaShoah in the middle of the day, and you'll find that people will stop in their place as to take a moment of remembrance. Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut are grouped together because they're one day after the other. Yom HaZikaron is Israel's Memorial Day, and Yom HaAtzmaut is Israel's Independence Day. Again, they come one after the other, which is, I think, both strange in one way, and also it's what makes them both powerful as a unit. Yom HaZikaron, you will find that people will go to the cemetery to visit people who have fallen in battle. There's also a siren on Yom HaZikaron. You sometimes will find, you just go onto YouTube and type in siren and Yom HaZikaron, and you'll see people getting out of their cars on the highway. Traffic stops on the highway, people get out of their cars, and they stand at attention for 2 minutes in honor of those who died in Israel's wars, beginning with not only the War of Independence, but even before that, I believe. And Yom HaAtzmaut, there's this moment where Yom HaZikaron turns into Yom HaAtzmaut, the celebration of the independence of Israel. And it is a nationwide celebration, which I would say, in spite of some complaining from some people that Yom HaAtzmaut isn't what it used to be, I still think that the focus on the core issue of independence and the wonder that is the existence of the state of Israel is still a lot more palpable on Yom HaAtzmaut than is, let's say, the feeling we get on July 4th here in the United States, where for many of us, I can't speak to each one of us, but for many of us, it is not really infused with the spirit of the meaning of the United States or of independence, perhaps because the United States is such an old country by comparison now. But Yom HaAtzmaut is full of cookouts, maybe like the United States too, but concerts and fireworks and silliness also, and kids activities, and it's a very big deal, and a day off from work as well. But you can tell, by the way, that we've been talking about Jewish holidays, right? And so many of the holidays that I've talked about, really all of the holidays that I've talked about, have involved what might be sort of simply called religion. But Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, not quite the same. Yom HaShoah, I said we read this Megillah, and in our synagogue, it is infused with a sense of a connection to Jewish history and tradition and religion. But for many people, even those who really note and find Yom HaShoah meaningful, it's not a very religious holiday, and certainly not Yom HaZikaron or Yom HaAtzmaut. I would say that Yom HaAtzmaut is maybe a particularly good example. There are many, well, millions of secular Israelis who don't do anything that looks at all religious on Yom HaAtzmaut. But both I and other religious Jews who celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, whether in the United States or anywhere in the world or in Israel, there are special prayers said. We say Hallel, right? We have a special Torah reading and a special Haftarah. It is infused with a religious spirit. And there'd be a whole conversation about what does it mean to celebrate the existence of the state of Israel as a religious event or a religious presence, as opposed to celebrating it as simply a political presence. Okay. So give me just a moment. I've been doing most of this without looking at my notes. I have a lot of notes, but I want to just see. Okay. I want to go back to that chart I showed you at the very beginning. I hope you can, see this again, and you can see some of the flow that we talked about. One thing that I didn't really focus on so much, even though I mentioned it earlier on, so I want to come back to it now, is this issue of national holidays as opposed to universal holidays. And I think the truth is that there's a way to think of many Jewish holidays as containing both. But again, if we focus on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, those are the ones that feel most universal in theme. The idea of repentance, forgiveness, renewal, the sweetness of hope for the coming year. Sukkot is one, though, where you can find really both themes. Sukkot is, as I told you, right, we build our sukkah as a reminder that God protected the Jewish people on our trip from the land of Egypt to the land of Israel. But I also said that Sukkot is supposed to remind us of the fragility of life. That's a universal theme. The idea of harvest is a universal theme, even though it's also sort of specifically tied to harvest times in a particular place, not West Bloomfield, but the land of Israel. Hanukkah, for, Peter, Paul, and Mary can sing a song about light one candle and make it a real focus on the universal idea of light and of fighting for freedom. And that is embedded in the holiday. But you also would be hard-pressed to find a more national holiday. Hanukkah, the flip side of this universal idea would be, it is about a particular people fighting for control to have their own particular land and then be able to shape their own destiny. Right? So you have both universal and particular in the holiday. Again, I spoke a lot about Passover at the beginning, but Passover it seems obvious why it's a national holiday, the birth of a nation, right? Becoming the Jewish people. By the way, here's an image you will never be able to forget if I haven't said it to you before. Why is Passover the time of our birth? Think about the biology of the birth of a human being. Through a narrow passage, right, and out into the world. Well, this is the sea, the crossing of the sea. And it's very wet in that sea, but it also is dry land. And we go through and we come out into a world where we are a unique, not individual, but individual nation. Passover, though, as much as it is a national holiday, also has all sorts of universal themes, so much so that just think of all of the different groups and nations which have taken on that story of Passover and made it their own. Perhaps, one of the most striking for our time is the degree to which the civil rights movement uses, it's their Bible too, right? The civil rights movement is primarily, a movement that was fighting on behalf of African Americans, right? And from their story and understanding of Passover, they incorporated it into an idea of a hope for freedom for our time, or for that time. Not only that, the images of matzah and of freedom are universal. Matzah, because it so much focuses on the idea of getting rid of the puffiness, right, which is involved in bread. Bread is puffed up. What does puffed up mean? If I said to you that so-and-so is puffed up, that's an arrogance. What does it mean to get flat like a piece of matzah? It is to purge ourselves of the arrogance that, takes hold of each one of us in different ways. So even within national holidays, there are themes that are universal and vice versa. Okay. Let me pull this off the screen for a moment. Okay, so I do have a few more things that I would say, but I've said most of it. So I'm going to ask again if you have questions.
Rabbi?
Yes, Rob.
I've often thought that the receiving of the Torah and finishing reading it should be closer together. And I've kind of concluded it has to do a lot with the festivals, the crops, and everything else. But it just seemed illogical that they be so far apart.
Right. So Rob is referring to Shavuot, which happens in the late spring, early summer, right, where we're celebrating the giving of the Torah. And Simchat Torah, which comes at the end of the fall holidays, where we are celebrating the conclusion of the reading. We have a reading cycle which begins and ends on Simchat Torah. And we finish reading the end of the book of Deuteronomy, and we begin reading the book of Genesis that very day, right? So I think it's a good point, right? So first of all, I mentioned to you that Shavuot is in the Torah, whereas Simchat Torah is not. And I think part of the explanation for this is that the Torah reading cycle sort of develops independently of these other holiday cycles. So it just so happened that is when the Jewish community, close to New Year's, right, ended the reading and started the reading again. And Shavuot is pegged to 7 weeks after Pesach. And they just are celebrating different elements of Torah in our life, right? But I do hear what you're saying, Rob. Other questions? Okay. So Okay, so I'll just go back to what Yitz Greenberg said at the beginning, that text that I posted at the beginning, which basically said that the ideas embedded in the Jewish holidays are meant to be both an expression of Jewish ideas, which are part of Jewish tradition very broadly, and also they are meant to, I'm sort of expanding a little bit on what he said here, but they're also meant to reinforce those ideas by really focusing on them on particular moments of the year, so that they then spill over into the daily life of individual Jews and of the Jewish community. So if you think about how I've touched several times on the idea of tzedakah, right? Whether it's Purim or it's Pesach or it's Sukkot, whatever it is, all these different ways of embedding care for those who need help into the holidays. Well, it's both because tzedakah is an important value within Jewish community, and because by focusing on it, it then spreads out into other parts of our lives. You could say that about a variety of different elements within the celebration of the holidays. And by the way, going back to Shabbat, which we talked about just briefly at the very beginning, our Kiddush for Shabbat talks about both the Exodus from Egypt and the creation of the world. Why both of those? Because there are links, right? The idea that Shabbat is supposed to be a day of rest for a community that was enslaved and was then freed, right? That is built into Shabbat. And also the idea that we rest because God rested on the seventh day. So they're both embedded there. And those are like critical ideas about how we are supposed to shape our society. To shape society, a society like all societies, which have a tendency to end up hierarchical, and to try to minimize that, maybe just one day a week, like on Shabbat, as a model for the direction our society should be going, so that hierarchies are broken down over time. Or just the idea that work and rest are two sides of the same coin and should be two parts of our lives. We shouldn't only be resting. God needs us to work in a variety of different ways, whatever work means. But also, God has given us and commanded us to rest. Work is not supposed to be all that your life is about. So, we have this every 7 days. We say that Kiddush, and we're reminded of the idea that we are free and that we have a responsibility to use our freedom in productive ways, and that we are given the command to rest because God wants that for us as well. A life which is devoted only to work is a life of slavery. Okay? So these ideas get embedded, and then again, they're supposed to spill out into our lives and into the fabric of society. So we are going to leave it there, and I'm going to say that what I hope is this very quick introduction has both reminded you of things that you knew, and I hope for some of you at least, it has taught you some things that you didn't know about the holidays. I'll just reiterate what must be painfully obvious by now, that there is no way to fully explain all of the holidays in just an hour, but lucky for you, there are about 1,000,001 resources for learning about the holidays, from books to online to other classes here and elsewhere about the holidays. And I would just say that, one important part of celebrating the holidays for me, and I think built into Jewish tradition, is preparing for the holidays. So, you shouldn't show up to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, since that's the one coming up. You shouldn't show up to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah without having gotten your mind around the idea of what Rosh Hashanah is and what it could mean, should mean for you, not just what it says in the books about what it means, but what that theme means for you this year at this time. You shouldn't show up at the Seder table without having given some thought to what your life is like because you are free. And then you have the opportunity to talk about that at the Seder. The same is true of all the holidays. So preparing ourselves intellectually and spiritually for the celebration really adds to that celebration. Okay, so I wish you a year coming up of wonderful celebrations and wonderful holidays. If you have any questions, you can stick around for a few minutes. You're welcome to write to me, and really glad you're here. Have a good night.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.